For a long time now, I've been thinking of producing a book that reveals some of the rich collection of images of the village that the famous Bridport photographer Claud Hider took over 100 years ago. I've been fortunate that the Charmouth Local History Society has kindly backed this, and at last there is an illustrated book available that is being launched tonight at just £7.99. You can buy a copy here or through outlets such as Morgan's in the village. I will now briefly cover Claud Hider's life, which I go to in more depth in the book. Before the age of postcards, local photographers such as William Shepherd of Bridport would produce views and sell them affixed to card in their shops. They provide a wonderful early record with some of Charmouth dating from 1860. Here are just some of the many that were produced of the village. People would also visit the studios of the photographers to have their photographs taken, and they were produced as carded visits. They were extremely popular and literally millions were produced. Unfortunately, very few have the names of the sitters on them. The images above are from one of these that was produced by Robert Hider. This gentleman was Claud Hider's father, and it was from him that he was to learn his skills. The back of the card gives the address of two studios that he owned in Sheerness and Gravesend in Kent. After time spent fighting in the First World War, where he was badly wounded, Claud moved with his wife Edith to Bridport in 1921. Here he worked briefly for Robert Potts in his photographic studio. Claud later teamed up with Henry Lawrence and they toured the surrounding villages, recording all they saw as postcards. In 1922, he purchased number 42 South Street in Bridport and converted it into a shop and studio where he would sell his postcards. Between the years 1922 and 1930, Claud recorded most of the village photographically with small batches of postcards which he would sell from William Holly's store, which was also the village post office. He was quite prolific, would often go back to the same view at a later date when changes had occurred. I collected over 200 of these and chosen 100 of the best to illustrate my book on Charmouth 100 years ago. You can sometimes see his car in the photograph, which was a Talbot that he bought in 1922 to tour the villages round Bridport. Local collector Ken Farmer has over 1,500 of these and has kindly assisted me with compiling the book. I'm also indebted to Peter Hider, the grandson of Claud, for photos and information about his family. The first picture shows how Claud would take a portion of the large negative and scratch the title and number, which he would then develop as a postcard. Below is the first postcard so far found from Charmouth, which is dated 7th of September 1922. The picture to the right shows Claud with his camera on Charmouth Beach photographing local fisherman Tom Hunter near the Heritage Coastal Centre. We are fortunate that Kellys produced a directory of private residents and traders for Charmouth in the year 1923. The year after Hider's first postcards, it is interesting to read the diverse businesses. Amongst these was a cycle shop, French polisher, monumental mason, fossil dealer and coal merchant. There were 5 pubs, the New Commercial Inn, the Star Inn, the George Inn, the Royal Oak and the Coach and Horses. Visitors had a number of places to stay, which included hotels, guest houses and apartments. It seems that Charmouth had so much to offer that it was almost self-sufficient. The 1926 Ordnance Survey map above is helpful in locating streets and buildings referred to in the book. The selection of photographic postcards produced by Claud Hider follows an imaginary circular walk of the street, highlighting interesting buildings that feature in the views and their past. Many of these are extremely rare and have never been published in the book before. The walk will begin and end at the junction of Lower Sea Lane with the street where the pharmacy is today. The illustrations then widen out to include Lower and Higher Sea Lane, as well as views along the beach. This aerial photograph taken in 1926 covers most of the area in the book. It clearly shows how the development of the village was confined to the length of the street by the 14th century monastic wall, still to be seen to the north. St Andrew's Church and its rectory are seen in the centre, with the Coach and Horses Hotel on the right. A large number of houses had extensive gardens, the church hall and school facing each other in Lower Sea Lane. A large field on the corner of the lane and the street was known as Pear Tree and was owned by Harry Pryor, who had his builders and masons yards in part of it. Claud Hider regularly provided the photographs for the annual Charmouth Visitors Guide. The first of these was published in 1934, and the following 2 pages provide a window into the village in that year. Although the majority of Claud Hider's output was in the 1920s, he still supplied photographs for both the Charmouth and District and Bridport and District official guides most years until 1953. The guides would often use images that he had earlier published as postcards. His main outlet for sales was the village post office, at that time run by William Holly. Here's another page from the 1934 District Guide showing the many businesses and guest houses the village had at that time. This astonishing photograph shows us an elephant from a visiting circus outside the shop soon after they were built in 1934. The elephant is standing near the entrance to Harry Pryor's stonemason's yard. This was sold on his death, and the shops we know today were built on the site soon after. This view looking down the street is almost unrecognisable today, apart from the building in the corner which houses the pharmacy. The original structure dated back to the 18th century, when it was the office for the steward of the manor. After a time as a carpenter's workshop, it was bought by the Pryor family, who established the monumental masons there. This flourished until the death of Harry Pryor in 1932, when the field to the right, known as Pear Tree, was sold to Stapleforth, and several shops and houses were later built there. Almost the same view taken by Claud 30 years later, towards the end of his life, and used in the 1953 Guide to the Village, clearly showing the transformation of the field once known as Pear Close. In the foreground can be seen the entrance to Bragg's store. In the distance are Lloyd's Bank and the chemist, with Gear's Garage on the side of the Queen's Arms Hotel and restaurant. Although most of the buildings are still there, the types of businesses have changed. This is one of the earliest photographs of the garage, opened by Billy Gear in 1927. In time, he built a small garage on the field known as Pear Close, which gradually grew into a substantial building with a large frontage onto the street and workshops stretching behind it. He must have been Charmouth's foremost businessman at the time, for as well as the garage, he owned the large car park by the footbridge near the East Cliff and built a number of houses in the village. A later photograph of the outside of this garage showing Billy Gear standing smartly in the centre with his workmen alongside his vehicles. Adverts in the local directories detail the extensive range of services he could offer, from his well-equipped workshop for repairs and servicing. He originally had Austin Vauxhall and Standard cars for sale, but towards the end he was a Ford agent and was able to offer cars as well as lorries for hire and run excursions to local places of interest. Claud Hider's photographic postcards are of such high quality that it's possible to enlarge areas and to provide a detailed study of activity in the background. In this case, we see a candid shot of an old lady stopping for a taxi outside Gear's Garage on the right. A garage mechanic has the bonnet of the car up to carry out a repair. A group of ladies with aprons can be seen outside the George Hotel, and in the distance we see another automobile parked on the pavement. The historic Abbot's house was built in 1525 by Thomas Chard, Abbot of Ford, for his cousin Ralph Tibbs, who was steward for the village. In 1651, Charles II stayed there for one night in his attempt to flee the country after the Battle of Worcester. He failed in this in part because the wife of the master of the ship, Stephen Limbury, found out what her husband was up to and locked him in their house. By the time he got out, it was too late and the king had left. The postcard was published in 1922 when it was the manse for the minister of the adjoining chapel. Claud Hider would often return to Charmouth and recall changes in the village. He produced this postcard in 1934 for Clifford Stapleforth, the new owner of the Abbot's house, then known as the Queen Arms. It had formerly been the manse for the adjoining Congregational Chapel for over 200 years, and he converted it into a hotel. Part of it became a tea room, as shown here, with extensive gardens at the rear. It remained a popular hotel until fairly recently and has now reverted back to being a private house. Following the German invasion in Europe in 1940, there was a real threat of invasion. Anthony Eden made a radio appeal to men aged between 16 and 65 to form a defence force called the Local Defence Volunteers, LDV. The Charmouth unit was formed by the commanding officer, Colonel Little, who lived in the house in the corner of the street on Lower Sea Lane called Sandford. They are seen here marching past the Queen's Arms on the right. This photograph of the volunteers was produced as a postcard by Claud Hider in 1942 and shows many villagers in the village at that time. Photos of this end of the street are very scarce, and this is the only one that I've found of the Lilacs and Mintaker on the right. There appears to be a small grocer's store called the Matchbox in front of the Lilacs at that time, which would be in the 1920s. Had an extensive garden, was the home for many years of Fred Penny, his wife and 4 children. Mintaker was where Samuel Hansford lived for a time and was built by Penny in part of his grounds. The ivy-covered building on the left was originally a toll house built after 1827 when the Bridport Trust was established. There is another identical red brick toll house at West Allington in Bridport, constructed at the same time. The system of collecting tolls for maintaining the road came to an end in 1877 and the toll house became a residence. On the right are Catherston cottages. This photograph allows us to get a close-up of the Talbot automobile that Claud Hider was driving in 1928. It quite often appears in postcards at the time. You can just make out the head of a small child in front of the steering wheel. On the right is the road leading to the steep climb of Stoneborough Hill. The ivy-clad building in the distance is Stoneborough Manor, which at that time was run as a girls' school. On the right of the bridge are the former mill buildings. In 1295, William, Abbot of Ford, required each burgess of Charmouth to have his corn ground at this mill. After the dissolution of the monastery, it was owned by the Pole family of Shute, who continued renting it until selling it to Robert Knight in 1783. It was later bought by Colonel John Bullen Symes Bullen of Catherston Manor, who installed John Gillingham as a miller there. This amazing photograph taken in 1937 is of a lorry poled high with barrels precariously hanging over the former bridge, which was later altered and widened in 1957. The Old Mill Bridge was built by the county in 1824 and was one of several bridges which contained the following warning. Dorset, any person wilfully injuring any part of this county bridge will be guilty of felony and upon conviction liable to be transported for life by the court. Signed T. Fuchs. A close-up of the bridge shows the T. Fuchs sign on the right. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, has a link with Charmouth. His great-grandfather was a rector here. He and his son John lived in the house where Mill View is today until they sold it in 1668. Bartholomew Wesley was made rector in 1645 by the parliamentarians and supported their cause. A nostalgic view from the bridge towards the George Inn, with the workmen repairing the road on the left of Mill View. This terrace was built in 1857 after the earlier ancient house was destroyed in a fire 6 years before. It was let initially to the Admiralty for £100 a year before they built their own coastguard cottages in Lower Sea Lane. The tall gabled building on the right, called Furlands, was occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Toms. It had previously been where the volunteer band had their drill hall. 3 workmen looking back at us by the side entrance of the gabled house that was demolished in the 1980s to create Barney's Close at the rear of the street. The row of cottages were at one time thatched and was once owned by Frank Coles. On the left is a sign for Bow House, which had a tea garden at the rear. An early view dating from 1922, looking up the street from Bow House on the right and Grage House on the left. The cob wall onto the street is a survival from when walls were made with straw and clay. The road surface seems very dusty and signs of the original cobbled surface is clearly seen at sides. Bow House had a large sign promoting its tea rooms. Both it and its neighbour Stowe House were built in 1804 by the sailcloth maker William Bernard. The first reference to Billy Gear is in the Kelly's Directive 1923, where he is described as a car hirer. He initially garaged his vehicles in the 2 sheds owned by Harry Pryor, the stonemason. The business prospers, and his next move was to stabling at the rear of the George Inn. This is a delightful old postcard of him with his mechanic standing proudly alongside his 2 taxis. He is sporting a bow tie, which was to become his trademark. Charmouth is very fortunate in having one of the oldest continually run inns in the country. The George has a remarkable history stretching back to the Middle Ages when the village was owned by Ford Abbey. The dating of the building is based on the roof timbers the 16th century would confirm its ownership and constructed by the monks. Its deeds date from 1702 when James Dover paid £60 to John Burridge for a 1,000-year lease. The building on the left, Sunnyside, now known as Devon's Edge, was run as a bakery and tea room by the Cole family with a hotel on the upper floors. The photograph was taken in 1928 and shows the garage operated by Charles Woolard that stood in the forecourt of Lansdowne House. At that time, the village had two garages facing each other. The ivy-clad building next to it was the Wander Inn, which had formerly been known as the 16th century Rose and Crown. Another wonderful photograph of the towering Devon Edge Hotel taken by Claud Hider in 1928 from the grounds of Harry Pryor's mason's yard. The hotel was built on the site after a disastrous fire in 1895 had destroyed a group of buildings as far as Bars Lane. It had a somewhat checkered history as a hotel and was later divided into apartments and shops. The carved ship's figurehead in the centre was washed up on the beach and placed in the grounds of the workshops. Fire in 1895 swept through three large houses and completely destroyed them. Two plots were quickly rebuilt as Sunnyside, now Devon's Edge, and Lansdowne House. The other, owned by Harry Pryor, was left as a garden, shown on the left, which led up to his house at the top of Bars Lane, then known as Lane's End. It was auctioned the year after his death in 1931. Clifford Stapleforth paid £370 for this lot and £250 for the parcel of land opposite, both of which were later developed into shops and houses. George Restorick is seen here proudly standing in front of his shop. He was originally from Axminster and early had a butcher's by the Grange Garden, opposite the George. He's one of the first four occupiers in the newly built shops in 1934. He was there until the 1960s, when Morgan's took over the shop and later extended into Child's Shop, which is why today they still carry a large DIY stock at the back. Ernest Thompson, standing in the doorway of his draper's shop in the corner of Bars Lane and the street. It was he who submitted plans for 4 shops. Ernest was to take the corner building for himself and opened it in 1934 with his wife Ethel. Andrew Dunn took the next one as a jeweller's. Harold Smith ran his bakery from the next shop and placed a large gold Hovis sign above his door. Finally, George Restorick took the 4th unit. On July 20th, 1895, Charmouth suffered its most disastrous fire. It began in a thatched roof, and by the end of the day, 3 large houses were completely destroyed. They formed a group, and it was only the gaps between them and their neighbours that prevented the fire from spreading further. On that day, Charmouth was to lose many historic properties. The most important of these was the one known as Streets, which occupied the site on the corner where the 4 shops are today. This old photograph is of young school children outside the building known as the Limes, now Charmouth Lodge, situated on the corner of Bars Lane. It would have been originally one of the workshops of the sailcloth maker Jacob Ridley Kitt, who lived next to it in Little Lodge. Richard Whittington was to move to the village with his wife and family in 1900. He was a direct descendant of the Mayor of London, made famous in pantomime. It was their daughters who would later run a private school from the premises. This is a wonderfully candid photograph Claude took looking down the street in 1922. William Dampier's grocer's shop is on the left. Next to it is a sign for the Star Inn, which stood at the end of an alleyway. The other side of it was Little Lodge with its high hedge. Further on are the tall lime trees that gave the house its name and which is now known as Charmouth Lodge. On the right of the picture is a young lady with a child in a pushchair next to Fred Marsh's delivery van alongside his butcher's shop at Winton House. Charmouth Stores is one of the oldest grocer's shops in the country. It was established in 1807 by Joseph Bradbeer, initially as a post office. After his death, it was run by his wife, Lydia, who sold it in 1833 to John and Wilmot Carter. Their son John took on the business until 1864, when a devastating fire tore through the group of thatched properties. They were rebuilt by Giles Pryor and James Hawkins bought the shop. He was there only briefly until selling to George Mortimer, who greatly extended the range of goods that it sold. It then went through the ownership of Edward Vince and John Baker. Charmouth Stores went through a period of decline under the ownership of John Baker until it was bought by William John Dampier in 1919. He had moved from Dorchester, where he worked for the department store of Boones and Sons. This photograph from 1935 shows William with his staff. From the left, it is believed that the people shown are Percy Larkham, a young assistant who lived next door, Cecil Bugler, an assistant, Sammy Smith, a delivery man, Peter Aldworth, provisions, Donald Hubert Dampier, the son, Gladys Frampton, daughter, and William John Dampier, the owner. The photograph shows the new shop front that can still be seen today. G.K. Chesterton, of Father Brain fame, was a frequent customer at Charmouth Stores. One of the verses he was famous for was The Wicked Grocer, which reflected badly on the trade. But after the impeccable service he received from the Dampiers in 1929, he penned a new verse which he dedicated to William, called The Good Grocer, that is full of his praises. After William Dampier's death in 1955, it was taken over by his son Donald, and later by Ron and Jean, who continued to run it until the year 2000. It's now known as NICER and run as a family business by the Trittons. This superb photograph of members of the Pryor family outside Stanley House, where they lived from 1841. In the picture are Lily Coleman, Ellen Pryor, Paul and Geoffrey Coleman with Peter, that's Lily and Geoffrey's infant son. The house was one of a row of 4 rebuilt by their ancestor Giles after a disastrous fire in 1864 and called Prospect House. It was his son Harry who was to continue his business. Next door is Rupert House with Charmouth Stores at the end. In 1870, Mary Stewart, who lived at the court, bought Backlands Farm at the rear of the street. When she died 2 years later, her estate went to her unmarried daughter Catherine, who retained it until her death in 1891. It was during her ownership that the substantial house at the front was built and now consists of 2 parts, Harding and Backlands Farmhouse. On Catherine Stewart's death, the farm was later bought by Frederick Joliffe, who had his dairy there, and where villagers were able to buy their fresh milk. This photograph shows clearly 2 of the 3 ivy-clad houses that formed Hillside Terrace. Joseph Wilson from Lyme Regis chose to demolish 2 former cottages and replace them with 3 identical Regency houses with large gardens set back from the street. He instructed Sir Geoffrey Whitefield as the architect, who was famous for the work he carried out at Windsor Castle, Chatsworth and other stately homes. The work was completed in 1824 and a number of famous people were to reside there in due course. The long, shuttered, wisteria-covered building filling the view is the court, which is directly opposite the War Memorial and at that time was occupied by James Shorch. His sister Alice was married to Alfred Haggard, whose brother Ryder Haggard, author of King Solomon's Mine, was a frequent visitor at the court. When he required names for 2 of his characters for the novel he chose Leo Vincey after Edward Vince, the owner of Charmouth Stores, and L. Horace Holly after William Holly, the owner of Langley House. The house in the foreground, now called Monk's Rest, had formerly been called Sycamore Cottage, and Mrs. Watson was living there when this photo was taken in 1927. I could just make out the outline of the court, its neighbour, behind all the trees in the front garden. This is one of the earliest postcards Claud Hider issued when he was in partnership with Henry Lawrence in 1922 and had the initials H&L inscribed on the negative with the number 108. The little stationer's shop run by Miss Elizabeth Tarr, shown in the foreground, no doubt was an outlet for this and other cards that he produced. Elizabeth was spent over 60 years there. The shop, which no longer exists, formed part of the larger Portland house. This wonderful postcard, dated 1922, shows some of the businesses in this part of the street at that time. At the top can be seen the New Inn, then the fish shop run by Cecil, brother of Billy Gear. The village GP, Alfred Barrett Hine, lived at Axley House. At Melville House was a store run by Wilfred Smith. Next door, at the rear of Walton House, Alfred Childs had his hardware shop, which is now the Fossil Shop. Frederick Hutchins was a cobbler living and working from Granville House. In the foreground is Claremont House, which at that time was a guest house run by Alfred and Hannah Hodges. Fred Hutchins is shown here with his wife Mary at their shoe shop, which formed part of Granville House where they lived. You can still see the shop, but has long since closed. Fred moved into the premises in 1920 and continued to live there until his death in 1970. He was a postman, fireman and parish councillor. Long's was a store in part of Melville House. It opened in 1937 as a grocery business and was in time the village post office. Nora and Ellis Long were very active in the village for over 30 years, and during the war Ellis was an incident officer with the Civil Defence Corps. The poster on the right for the Regent Cinema was one of many produced by Ellis to advertise local events. It advertises the film Crackerjack, which was released in 1938. The lady seen in the foreground is in the doorway of the Holt, which at that time was a shoe shop. On the other side of the street is a lady standing in the arch in a wall that still stands and leads to the garden of Melbourne House. She may well be Mrs. Mary Knott, who lived there. A little further down the street was Bruton House, where Francis Davis lived. It was later renamed the Warehouse, when the famous local historian Reginald Pavey retired there in 1926. This view, captured by Claud Hider in 1923, shows the junction of the Axminster Road with the street. At that time, Harry Wilde was living in the old thatched cottage on the left. After he died, it remained empty and was finally pulled down, and the site was used as a car park. Eventually, the road was widened and the neighbouring cottage was able to disappear. And the bus stop is now on the site. The ivy-clad building on the other side was the new commercial inn. As with many buildings that Claud Hider was to photograph in Charmouth, the new commercial inn was smothered with ivy. The building you see today replaces an earlier thatched inn that was completely destroyed in January 1888, together with its neighbour, a grocer's shop. The hotel was eventually closed by the brewery and divided into three properties: Grosvenor, Charleston and Heron Cottage. This postcard, dating back to 1923, shows the junction of the street with Old Lime Hill and Old Lime Road, which led through to the Devil's Bellows. The Old Lime Road was cut in 1825 as a link to Lyme Regis, as the old Roman road was steep and hazardous. The sign on the right warns motorists of the dangerous state of the collapsing road. On 26th of May 1924, the road was closed to all traffic after a further landslip. In our imaginary tour taken by Claud Hider 100 years ago, we have crossed over to the other side of the street. The gabled building on the left is Claremont, formerly known as Knapp House, which was a popular guest house run by Alfred and Hannah Hodges. Above it is Badger's, which was then occupied by George Grinter, who ran Foxley Farm, with its fields stretching from Old Lime Hill to Hirsey Lane. Bruton House and Melbourne House are above it. The large thatched building seen here in the centre at the corner of Hirsey Lane is very ancient, with a history stretching back at times when the village was owned by the Abbots of Ford, and it was a hostelry called the Fountain, after the stream that passed it, and which still exists along Hirsey Lane. The inn closed its doors in 1811, although later in the century it reopened as a hotel run by George Holly, who renamed it Charmouth House. This eventually closed in 2005 and was split into 4 dwellings. This is the earliest postcard by Claud Hider that has been found, and has the number 17A on the front, dating it to September 1922. It shows a view looking down the street with the Royal Oak and War Memorial erected in the same year on the right. The large sign above the entrance is a link to September 1651, when Charmouth was from where King Charles attempted his escape to freedom after crossed the Channel to France. After he failed, he travelled on to Bridport, and the painting on the sign is at the huge stone at Lee Lane commemorating his attempt. Claud Hider produced another view of the Royal Oak a few years later. At that time, the landlord was Jim Bridle. He retired in 1934 and continued to live at St Helena in Hirsey Lane before his death in 1953. His daughter married the successful garage proprietor and entrepreneur Billy Gear. Jim was born in Lyme in 1870 and went to sea when he was 11, joining the Royal Navy 4 years afterwards. He was made leading seaman in 1892 and Chief Petty Officer in 1902. He served in the Navy for 25 years. This photo of a group outside the Royal Oak on Remembrance Day in 1925 shows a number of members of important village families at that time. In the back row is Albie Cook, then Andrew Dunn and Jim Bryder, who was the landlord, Charlie Larkham and Shane Burridge. In the middle row is Billy Gear, Reg Rattenbury, Bill Gorge, Ted Hunter and Fred Hitchcock. And in the front row is Jim Bridle Jr., John Hodder, familiarly known as Scooter, and Boy, his dog. In 1896, after 90 years in the same premises where Nicer is today, the post office was taken over by William Holly and moved further up the street to Whittaker House, where it's to be run by the father and son, William Jr., for the next 40 years. When the father died in 1931, the son opened part of it as a stationery shop. The outline of the little house, now the local surgery, can be seen behind the high hedge further up the street. It was William Holly who would sell the many views of Charmouth that Claud Hider produced from the post office seen here. On the left is an annex that was built and let to a branch of the Wilson Dorset's Bank, which later was taken over by Lloyd's Bank. In due course, they moved to the bottom of the street in a premises that is the Bankhouse Cafe today. On the left is the extensive garden of the elms, whose ivy-clad frontage can just be seen. This is an ancient building which houses the parish council offices today. The Reverend Frederick Maltby was the rector of St Andrew's Church in 1923 and lived at the rear of the church in the rectory. The church replaced an ancient building which was demolished in 1835. It must have been depressing news when the village was told in 1835 by Charles Wallace, a Dorchester architect, that he had never seen so dilapidated or unsafe a building, and it was necessary to build a new church. However, the whole village worked with enormous energy to raise the money. The architect chosen to design the new church was Charles Fowler, whose mother, Jane, lived with her sister Lucy at Littlehurst, which is now the doctor's surgery. The former Coach and Indies can be seen in the centre. In the past, it was the focus of the important coaching trade that passed through Charmouth. It was here in 1803 that Jane Austen stayed and later wrote highly of the village in her novel Persuasion as Charmouth, with its high grounds and extensive sweeps of country, and still more its sweet retired bay, backed by dark cliffs where fragments of low rock among the sands make it the happiest spot for watching the flow of the tide, for sitting in unwearied contemplation. The building we today replaced a much earlier inn that stood on the same site until 1882 when it was destroyed by fire. The line of taxis is seen here in 1926 in front of Billy Gear's garage, which used the former stables at the rear of the Coach and Horses. He was only there briefly before moving further down the street, where he built permanent premises. Sidney and Lily Boucher were the owners of the hotel in that year. Their son, Montague, was tragically killed aged 30 during the Second Battle of the Somme in 1918, and his name is one of those recorded on the village war memorial and the Book of Remembrance in the church. This magnificent postcard is a wonderful record of a long-lost era in Charmouth's history, when in 1926 it had a flourishing butcher's, garage and hotel next to each other. The young boys standing outside the doorway that led to the abattoir at the rear are the sons of Frederick Charles Marsh, whose shop window filled with meters behind them. Billy Gear can be seen at the garage entrance, wearing his cap and bow tie in one of the vehicles which he hired out from the former stables of the Coach and Horses. This postcard for 1924 is full of activity, showing a group of ladies with their young children in their stylish clothes and bonnets, standing on the road on the left, and a bus waiting for passengers outside the Coach and Horses, which was the route run by the Southern National Omnibus Company, and it took it from West Bay through Lyme Regis to Axminster, equivalent to the X31 today. Below the hotel are Winton House, Beach House, Carham House, Littlecote and Sandford House. This photograph, taken in 1923, shows how narrow Lower Sea Lane was at its junction with the street. The large building on the left was Sandford House, where Colonel Lytton lived. On his death in 1958, it was purchased by Dorset County Council and pulled down to improve the entrance to Lower Sea Lane. It had been one of three almost identical Regency properties, with Littlecote and Carham House built between 1834 and 5 by Samuel Dunn and his son-in-law William Hoare. The gabled building on the right with a stone cross was Harry Pratt's stonemason's workshop, which today forms part of the pharmacy. On the right of this photograph are the almshouses that were built in 1867 and paid for by Mrs. Napier Stewart, who lived at the court. She wished to demolish the original 17th century almshouses in order to build a coach house on its site next to her house. The old village school, founded in 1869, can be seen here in the centre with children at its small playground. In 1992, the school was rebuilt at the bottom of Lower Sea Lane and the old building converted into housing. The tennis club was originally entitled the Charmouth Private Lawn Tennis Club and was founded early in the 1880s. Had the most select membership, only the landed gentry, professionals such as doctors, lawyers and the like were accepted, and so it remained to the 1950s when it was open to a wider public. In the background can be seen the old village school. This is enlargement of one of the views Claud Hider took of Lower Sea Lane in 1922 before it was built on. In the foreground are the coastguard cottages. Behind it is the church hall, now the community hall, and on the right is the village school. This is a view looking towards Lower Sea Lane across the River Char. In the background is Hammond's Mead, built by Miss Gertrude Evans. On the horizon, on Old Lyme Road, you can see the long outline of Downside. The nearest house in the foreground is Sea View, where the Hunters, a local fishing family, used to live. This is an early photograph taken in 1934, soon after the wayside tea gardens and cafe were opened by Harriet Forte. They stood at the bottom of Lower Sea Lane and offered homemade cakes and dainty teas with views over the sea. Its name is commemorated in Little Tea Gardens, the development of flats that stands on the site today. Behind it are the five houses, Orchard End, Pembroke, Tideswell, Brackedon and Broadland, built in 1924 by Clifford Stapleforth. The postcard was published by Claud Hider in 1925 and shows the bottom of Lower Sea Lane. The galvanised tin roof buildings were known at the time as Tin Town, built as cheap rentals after the First World War. The area was looked down on for a long time by villagers. The earlier bridge across the River Char can be seen here before it was replaced in 1930. Mrs. West is seen here in 1930 opening a new footbridge over the River Char, which was only recently replaced after many years of service. An estimate of £300 was made by Bristol firm, but John West considered this excessive and suggested building one with local labour. He, Fred Penny, the carpenter, and others set to work, and the bridge was built for £193, thereby saving the parish over £100. Another wonderfully detailed view of the village taken from Cain's Folly by Claud Hider in 1926. Stoneborough farmhouse with its associated outbuildings and barns can be seen in the foreground. Houses are scattered amongst the fields which would later be built upon after the Second World War. The entrepreneur George Freen commissioned the construction of the cement works near the existing lime kilns by the mouth of the River Char and the sea. His sister Anne Freen had married Michael Morecambe with a background in quarrying. The Morecambes were ideal candidates to run a cement factory for George. By January 7, 1853, the building we see today had been finished by the local builders Priors. Unfortunately, the business wasn't a success, and in 1864, George sold his estate to John Hawkshaw for £6,000, and the factory was closed forever. The postcard is dated 1923, which is the year that the house in the background, named the latter, was under construction. This photograph, taken the following year, shows the latter completed. The owner was a Miss Grace Ickham, who had bought for £150 an acre of land from Douglas Pass, the Lord of the Manor of Charmouth, in 1922. She had the house built as a place to look after wounded soldiers coming from a hospital in Ealing. They would come down by train to Axminster Station, where they would be picked up and taken to Charmouth to recover. This photograph is of Tom Hunter by the lookout. He initially rented out his bathing machines and later replaced these with tents. Tom manufactured these himself during the winter months and later constructed the beach huts. For many years he was a familiar figure on the beach and was known to many visitors as its first custodian. He died in 1936, aged 79. The Beach on a summer's day in 1922 with visitors enjoying the waters. There were still a number of men fishing along its shores. They used lerrets, which were double-ended with a long high stem post to enable them to be launched off the steep beach and hauled up onto the beach to catch herrings. In the distance are the tents and beach huts that the hunters would hire out from their shed. An early photograph of the newly built beach huts. Above it stands the lookout, which was built in 1804 when lookouts and signal posts were constructed all along the south coast during the Napoleonic Wars. However, the invasion never came. During the first half of the 19th century, the lookout was used very effectively by the Excise and Coast Guard Service looking for smugglers. In 1909, its use as an observation post was discontinued. And in 1945, the building was given to Charmouth Parish Council. It now continues its original role as a lookout staffed by volunteers. This postcard shows the field on which, in 1922, the house called the Latter was to be built. On the horizon are several newly built houses: Commonside, the Moorings, Cove Cottage, Sanctuary House, and the Red Bungalow. Miss Helen Darroch was living in the Latter at this time, and it is her donkey, Patience, that can be seen in the foreground. This postcard, dated 1924, provides a view of the Latter surrounded by boundary fences shortly after its construction for Grace Ickham. It was bought by Sir Sidney Barrett in 1936. He was a famous scientist and businessman who was a scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, encouraged the design of the bouncing bomb by Barnes Wallis to him. Behind it, you can see some of the houses that form part of the bottom part of Highsea Lane. This unusual postcard shows just 3 of the 5 houses that were built on an acre plot called Single Common for Mr. Axford Hodges, who was living at Claremont on the street. Claud Hider must have published this card especially for him. The houses were built in 1928 by the local builder William Cooper from Lyme Regis. The 5 houses in order from the junction of Highsea Lane are Culin, the Croft, Sea Meadow, the Lees and Lias Lees. In the distance can be seen Stoneborough Hill. As well as publishing numbered views of the village to resell in his shop or other outlets, such as the post office in Charmouth, Claud Hider would also take on special commissions. This was the case with this wonderful view looking down onto Highsea Lane with the impressive Seahorse House Hotel in the background. It was one of a pack of 6 separate views relating to the Claremont boarding house in 1931, which had been given out to guests by the owner, Elizabeth Littleberry. This postcard, published by Claud Hider in 1932, shows us the newly opened playing fields. It was in this year that the former resident Charles Hodges left the village £1,000 to purchase land from Douglas Pass. In 1864, Sir John Hawkshaw planned a railway to link Bridport with Lyme Regis. The station was to be built on Charmouth Mead, where the recreation field is today, with entry down Bars Lane. It was never built as the government at that time dismissed the idea, and Hawkshaw put his estate up for auction soon after. Claud quite often included his Talbot automobile in his photographs, where I could just make out a child's face with a woolly bonnet on her head. On the left is the entrance to the former Charmouth Tunnel, which was opened in January 1832. The tunnel was made so that coaches could avoid Fern Hill, and it reduced the climb over Thistle Hill. It became redundant when the Charmouth bypass was built in 1990, and in 2004 it was transformed into the Target Sports Centre with its rifle range. The photograph on the left shows a horse and cart passing through Charmouth Tunnel. The other postcard provides a unique record of the sad end of Pasha the lion from Chapman Zoo, who on the 22nd of June 1929 escaped on the road near Fernhill just outside Charmouth after the tractor pulling his cage hit a tree. Crowds gathered to see the sight, and the frightened animal bounded over a hedge at Lily Farm, saw some cows and seized one by the throat. Fred Marsh, the local butcher, shot the poor animal dead, and the photo taken by Claud Hider and published as a postcard shows him at the doorway of the farm. This view taken by Claud Hider in 1929 is difficult to interpret today, as the cottage in the middle must have been demolished for the present-day bypass, and the site is now under the roundabout at the top of Charmouth. The sign in front of the cottage advised drivers to fork left for Lyme Regis and right for Exeter. After a number of lorries and other vehicles crashed into houses and shops on the steep hill into the village, the Ministry of Transport was finally convinced of the need for a bypass, and it was constructed in the 1990s. This photo marks the end of the talk and the former coastal road that once linked Charmouth with Lyme Regis. On the 26th of May 1924, the road was closed to all traffic after a massive landslip. This dramatic photographic postcard was published as part of a series by Claud Hider of Bridport shortly afterwards. It showed how close to the edge of the cliff the side of the road was, with a sheer drop of 150 feet to the beach below.